Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. So with us here to see what's making the headlines is Daily Mirror columnist Susie Boniface and the political commentator Benedict Spence. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. Welcome. So let's see what is on some of those front pages. The Eye leads with the escalation of Israel's military action with the headline, Gaza blackout as Israel launches onslaught. The Daily Telegraph also has the conflict on its front page, describing tonight's move by the Israeli military as the largest advance since the war began. Carnage looms is the ominous headline in the Daily Mirror. The Guardian focuses on the plight of people living in Gaza, reporting that families are struggling for food and shelter. The Daily Express, meanwhile, labels Israel's actions tonight as unprecedented bombardment. And the Times' take on the war is back here in the UK. It reports on Iran hijacking British protests, saying Tehran agents are inflaming tensions here. And the Financial Times says news of declining share prices for NatWest in the wake of the report into its handling of Nigel Farage's banking affairs. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the program, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch with us. As I said, we're joined tonight by Susie Boniface and Benedict Spence. Thank you so much for joining us, even though, of course, all the headlines are pretty horrific. Let's start with the Mirror. A horrific picture, of course, showing the increased bombardment of the Gaza Strip. Susie, what do you make of it?
Well, the thing is that this has had to be... There's two telling things about this photograph. The first is that it's in complete darkness, apart from the light from the incendiary bombs, and that's because all power has been cut off to the Strip. So there is nothing to illuminate what you're actually looking at, apart from the flames and the explosions. And it's set against this skyline. And the second thing, really, is that it's so far away. It's not taken from within the area that's being bombed. It's from outside, because there are very few journalists left in there. And the people who are there aren't able to get their signals, aren't able to get their stories and their pictures out. So in the days to come, there will be worse photographs that are taken in that area of the immediate impacts and what's happening. So there will be... This is just indicative of, as a journalist, just there's going to be worse photographs coming out in the next few days. And I think most people, no matter what side, not that you can be on a side in this, but no matter how you feel about what's happening in Israel and Palestine at the moment, it's what's happening right then is a human tragedy, has to be.
And we spoke to one of the heads of UNRWA, which is the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, and of course just mentioning what we've known for a while, that they're running out of everything and the situation is dire. Benedict, I mean, what do you think of coverage and pictures like this?
I mean, it's obviously very difficult, as frankly has been coverage of every aspect of this since the very beginning. And it's something, we saw it earlier on last year with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it's sort of bringing back home, I think, especially to Western audiences, the reality of war, whereas perhaps for some time they had been slightly insulated, whereas both of these conflicts seem a lot closer than even the other conflicts in the Middle East, frankly. They seem a lot closer to home. But they also, I think, drive a coach and horses through a lot of people's assumptions about things like a rules-based international order when you see what a war actually involves. And there's very little hiding from any of this, because actually when we had the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, we didn't have social media in quite the same way that we do now. We didn't even have that during the Arab Spring and what happened with that. And you are going to see, up close and personal, you're going to see fairly grotesque things, fairly horrific things. And people will remember this is actually how wars are fought. There is no way of conducting a sanitary war. Rules of engagement are off the table, frankly, when it comes to this sort of conflict. It's going to be very difficult for the Israel Defense Forces in Gaza. They're going to suffer heavy casualties. Civilians that are stuck there are going to suffer appallingly. And, of course, whatever fate befalls Hamas will befall them. There are going to be very few winners, frankly, from the situation.
I mean, unsurprisingly, it's on all the front pages. If we look at the Telegraph, it says Israel's ground forces advance on Gaza. Netanyahu's war cabinet sanctions onslaught after hostage release talks break down, because there had been this discussion, hadn't there, Susie, that Qatar was basically a mediator and 4 hostages in total had been released, but of course 4 out of 220 plus isn't much. It looks like the Israelis have lost patience with that.
And another thing that's going to happen as a result of this is that with this particular conflict, there is no opportunity really for anybody to kind of be embedded with one force or another. And so journalists from reputable organisations are not able to get in there, and there's going to be a void. And the information which will therefore start being put out on social media may well be, as we've already seen in recent weeks, grabbed from other conflicts and other events and wrongly labelled as saying this has just happened in Palestine, this has just happened in Israel, and feeding misinformation. And until authoritative journalists can get in there and actually start unpicking what's happened, we're not going to know what's happened with some of those hostages, whether 50 really were killed in the airstrikes, as Hamas said, whether any of them have managed to get out, whether any of them were even still alive. When
I mean, a lot of broadcasters do rely on their teams that live there, so there are people linked to authoritative organisations. But Benedict, I mean, the fear is that once the ground invasion begins, not only would it be horrific in Gaza itself, but there's a fear that it could spark other conflicts with Hezbollah and Syria. What do you make of it, and the possibility of it bringing in other nations?
This is difficult because a lot of other players have set themselves their red lines, and they've said if there is a ground invasion of Gaza, then we might be tempted to get involved. Even the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, said that we would be prepared, Turkey would be prepared militarily to protect Gaza, which nobody in their right mind believes he would actually do, given that he is a NATO member, and that would mean going against the express wishes of the United States. But the idea is, of course, we're talking about Iran specifically. I can envisage a situation where the militias around Hezbollah, Kataib Hezbollah, all the various different proxy groups that Iran has would be prepared to get involved. But they might not be especially popular once they understand what the backlash would be. Hezbollah would be able to launch a salvo at Israel, but it cannot defend itself against the Israeli Air Force. It cannot defend itself against the United States, should the United States choose to get involved. And I cannot believe, actually, that Iran would be foolish enough to do it without a nuclear weapon. Ultimately, that is where their leverage comes. If it was simply a war between themselves and the Israeli Air Force, well, they can't win that war.
It's interesting you mentioned Iran, because that's mentioned in the front page of the Times. But before we get to it, I just want to have a look at the front page of The Guardian, because I think it has a picture that obviously is heartbreaking. The headline, "No fuel, no power, nowhere safe life on the streets of Gaza." And the picture there is of people waiting at a morgue in Khan Yunis, which is to the south of the Gaza Strip, to collect the bodies of relatives killed in airstrikes. So that really sort of, showing the level of pain experienced by people on the Strip. But looking at the Times, headline there, "Iran hijacking UK protests. As Israel expands operations in Gaza, police tell of Tehran agents inflaming tensions in Britain." Because, of course, tomorrow we're going to see the third demonstration pro-Palestinian. What did you make of this story, Susie?
Well, it's kind of obvious in a way, because, it's not obvious, but it's one of those things where when you see the story, you're not surprised, because Hamas wants a war with Israel. There is no way it could ever hope to fight or have much go at a war with Israel. The only way it could do that is to provoke other countries to fight Israel on its behalf. And that is exactly what it did with the October the 7th attacks. It deliberately and provocatively did something so brutal and so horrific that it was going to cause a massive backlash from Israel, which would then lead to invasion and the mass deaths of innocents in Palestine, and then other nations around that would have to start getting involved. And then the US gets involved, as Dominic says, and then before you know it, you have a massive conflagration. That is exactly what Hamas wants. It is exactly what Hezbollah wants, and it is exactly what Iran wants. And they are the major player in this region. They're the ones that fund and support Hezbollah. They are the ones who are said and thought and believed to have supplied a lot of the weapons for the October the 7th attacks. This is exactly what they need. It's what the mullahs in Iran want, because they've got their own internal protests and dissent, and they need to have a war to kind of prove what they're doing. So,
I mean, operating through proxies is, as Susie says, that's what Iran does. But this is the key thing, is that Iran, I think, recognises that it isn't powerful enough to fight a war by itself. It could defend itself against an invasion like the invasion of Iraq very well. It is prepared for that sort of thing, but it doesn't have the capacity to fight a war abroad. It might also have made the mistake, which is to force a lot of Arab nations into a bit of a tight corner. Now, obviously, when Israel began its bombardment of Gaza, you had a lot of condemnation from a lot of the Arab world, but you noticed in certain key areas, Morocco, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the language was tempered in a way that it's never been before, because I think a lot of them understand, having begun the process, or in some cases actually signed the arrangements with Israel at the behest of the United States, they've got to come down on a side, and they aren't going to come down on the same side as Iran. So ultimately, has Hamas sort of forced a play and force the rest of the Muslim world into sort of taking sides, the Arab world into taking sides, they might not find that everybody comes down on the side that they used to come down on.
I mean, it has to be said, though, that there's, you know, the non-state actors and then the states, but then there's also the so-called Arab street. And it's, you know, the Palestinian cause is something that is felt very deeply and obviously felt very deeply here as well, which I guess we're going to see examples of.
Yeah, but I think what was odd about the protests that we've seen and which we're going to see again tomorrow is that you have people who are perfectly reasonable within that protest who want there to be no war, who are worried about people losing their lives unnecessarily and want there to be less war and less violence and everyone to be nicer to each other. And they are marching alongside people who are genuinely calling for more war and more violence and more deaths. And the fact that those two people are able to march side by side and think they're talking about the same thing is astonishing to me. It's just astonishing. I mean, I've no objection to peace protests and I've no objection to people wanting to talk about Palestine or Israel, two-state solution or anything else. But to have people calling for jihad at the same time you have people calling for an end to war, I find, I can't say the word, but a head blower.
Yes.
Leave it there for now. But thank you, Susie and Benedict, for being with us. Do stay with us. Coming up, NatWest shares suffer in the wake of its own damning report into its handling of Niger.